So just a very quick reminder on what a FLOSS license is. FLOSS means for freely licensed open source software. Basically, you have 4 major rights associated to such a license. When you produce some software and you give it to someone else with a FLOSS license, you give him those 4 rights. First, he can use your stuff forever. There is no limit in time in what he can use. He can use it the way he wants, how he wants, and how long he wants. That's the first thing. The second freedom you are giving him is the freedom to look at the sources. That's mandatory in FLOSS licenses. You must provide the sources with the software so people can look at how it has been built and what is inside. You are free to change the software you received by changing the sources and do whatever you want with the sources. You have no limitation in what you are allowed to change in the software you receive. And you are free to redistribute to whoever you want as long as you follow, you do not try to restrict any of those freedoms to the people you redistribute afterwards. So that's basically what a FLOSS license means. That's the 4 important freedoms that are brought by those licenses. Note that nowhere here I speak about money. FLOSS has nothing to do with paying or not paying for what you get. You can distribute FLOSS software for free if you want, or you can charge for it if you want. That's completely unrelated to the FLOSS license model here. So let's speak a little bit about open source communities, because that's one of the focus of this presentation. First of all, the first point to realize is that those software communities are a reality today. They have changed completely the software engineering world in many, many different ways. And you have extremely visible projects that are now managed by open source communities. The most obvious example for me, at least, is the Linux kernel community. But you have Eclipse is also extremely visible, and that's a huge community today. GCC is the one that we know most, and we can talk about it a bit later. Artemis is another example. And you have more, also now very successful user-oriented software that are also developed in open source communities, like Mozilla and open source and OpenOffice, for instance. What is interesting to realize is that those communities, some of them are more than 20 years old now. GCC is something like 25, the GCC community is more than 25 years, actually. So we are talking about very long-living communities in which the original developers have left their role to other people, that themselves have left their role to other people again. So basically, we are seeing that open source communities are providing a way to give to the software they manage some environment that is probably much more sustainable than environments you can find in companies, especially small companies that have a tendency to be created and disappear very quickly. The other important aspect about open source communities that we have seen in the last few years, and maybe in the last 10 years gradually, is that at the beginning of open source communities, individuals would contribute for themselves as individuals. And that has completely changed now. Now, most of the real contributors, you can depend on, are individuals, but working for a company, and the company decides that they should work in those communities. And actually, that's part of the job. We have seen that in the GCC community. 15 years ago, everybody was standalone, working on universities and things like that. And basically, the GCC project was so important for so many companies that the brilliant guys that were working on those communities were hired by companies like Google, Red Hat, SUSE, and so on, because they wanted to make sure that their vested interests as a company would be defended properly by the participants to this community. And that's also very interesting to see that in such open source communities, you can have competitors working together. Here, a good example on the GCC community is to see that Red Hat and SUSE that are competing to distribute Linux versions, Linux versions with GCC compilers in them, are collaborating to make sure that the GCC compiler that they will be distributing is of the best possible quality. So that's interesting to see that in such an environment, you can share technology, work together on technology, even if you compete on products at the end. That's possible, and that's happening already today. You see that major companies like IBM are extremely involved now in several different open source communities. Here it is mentioned in the context of the GCC community, but it is also obviously extremely involved in Eclipse and in probably many of the major open communities today. So that's important to see that I mean, this is a reality, and big companies believe in it. So in open source communities, you have many different participants that have different roles. So here I put 3 different roles, but you can probably find more of those. I mean, first of all, let's start with the passive users. The passive users are the people that look at what's happening in the community, get whatever technology they can, and use the technology for themselves without contributing back to the community. Some could think, well, that's not very good that those people don't contribute back what they have done, and so on and so on. Yes, maybe, but those people play an extremely important role because they are the vector that will make this community known in the outside world. And so passive users play an extremely important role in spreading the technology all over the place, which is one of the major advantages of open source technology. It is much easier to distribute it, to have a large community base in such an environment that with proprietary technology. But that's clearly, if there were only passive users, the community wouldn't go very far. So you also have active participants, and as a company, you have to realize that when you have some of your engineers that are participating to this open source community, that will cost you some money at start, for sure. Because if you want to be participating to those communities, your engineers will have to learn what are the rules of participating to those communities. They will not be able to use the processes of your company, but they will have to use different processes that are the processes that have been agreed upon in that community. And you also have to contribute back your change, because that's the important part of the work. And to contribute back your change, you have to do usually a lot of work, because you do your change in your context, and that solves your purposes. That's fine. For your own version, that's fine. But if you want to contribute back, you have to make sure that your changes are general enough and sufficiently well open so that they work in the general context of the software that is managed by the community. So that's a lot of work. Our experience is that contributing back is a lot of work, but this is also a necessary action if you want to benefit from the long-term cost decrease that are brought back by being an active participant to such communities. So what are those long-term benefits? Well, clearly, you are sharing resources with many different companies that have nothing to do with you, that do not have the same business needs than you, but you still benefit from their work in a sense. You do not have to solve a problem that has already been solved in the context of that community by somebody else. And if somebody else has solved it properly in the right way, that's so much work you don't need to do. And you can work with others to solve a problem in a way that is more general than what you would have need to do for yourself, making the software more usable at the end. So you have extremely strong benefits. Clearly, the main benefit is to profit directly from the added value that has been brought by other technologies. So that's interesting that in your presentation, Emmanuel, you were talking about growing software, because when you're talking about growing software, you are implying that software is organic in a sense. And I find it interesting to see that that's exactly what's happening in open source communities. You have organic software, which is not directly associated with specifications or requirements for a given project. Actually, there are various projects, completely different projects that are contributing to the same community, which are completely, and that grows and grows for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And it starts looking like some living system in its own right? And that's exactly what we are seeing happening here. And in fact, the environment that is provided by open source communities is so much richer than what you can find in a specific company that it makes the possibility of this living software to live a longer life and a better life at the end.